Welcome to the Animals at Home Network. My name is Dylan Perrin. Thank you very much for dropping in today. If it's your first time here, you'll find several different types of shows on the Animals at Home Network. First, you'll find my show, Animals at Home. You'll find Bryce Broom's show, Animals Everywhere. You'll also find roast sessions, which are casual conversations between Bryce and I. And finally, this is what we're introducing today, you will find round table discussions. The idea of roundtable discussions is something I've been tossing around for a while now, so I'm super excited we were able to pull off the first episode. This podcast format will have several guests at once, bring on several guests, and we'll have just casual conversation about one or two topics. Obviously, if you have more people on the show, it makes the episodes longer, so we want to keep them confined to one or two topics max. Joining me on the very first episode of Roundtable Discussions is Liam Sinclair of Reptiles and Research, Harvey Tweats from Celtic Reptiles and Amphibian, and Joseph Brabin from JTB Reptiles. The very first topic we discuss is bioactivity and whether or not it is the gold standard of reptile care. It is a term that does get tossed around slightly loosely in the hobby, so we kind of want to bring that in a little bit, talk about the benefits, but also the cons of using a bioactive setup. And finally, the last half of the discussion just talks about the responsibility of creating content on YouTube. So if you're a pet tuber or a reptile-related YouTube content creator, how much responsibility do you have as a creator to make sure you're providing good and accurate information? And is this something that we need to be thinking about on a deeper level? As I said, this is a long conversation. I really do hope you enjoy it. I don't want to spend too much time introducing it, so let's just jump into it. Enjoy. All right, well, gentlemen, welcome to the first round table. I'm super excited for this.
Hello.
So why don't we quickly wrap around our virtual table here, and you can just let everybody know your name, your YouTube channel, and then maybe one project you're working on. So either that's a video maybe you're working on or something in the reptile room or reptile outside area for Harvey, and then we'll jump into it. So why don't we start with Joseph?
Right, starting off with me then. So I'm Joe from JTB Reptiles, following nature's example and all that. I'm sort of the one that does indoor setups, but we're mainly focusing a lot on heating and lighting at the minute. The project that has been going on for this year and has sort of been the main one has been the Western Green Lizard enclosure build, which was a collaboration with Harvey and Tom from Celtic Reptile and Amphibian. And future projects, just, so you get an idea of the stuff I'm working with and where I'm going, is I've got a large indoor biotope build planned, and that is sort of going to be a little bit topical with what we're talking about today. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. And what about Liam?
I am Liam from Reptiles and Research, and currently I've got probably 8 projects on the go. I basically make videos dispelling myths in the hobby. I've currently got a video on why ball pythons are semi-arboreal. I've currently got a video coming out, collaboration with Joe tomorrow, Sunday, on belly heat versus overhead heating and the science behind that. And I've got one coming out soon on why snakes like tight spaces and the science behind that as well.
Very cool. And Mr. Harvey?
So I'm Harvey, and I'm part of Celtic Reptile and Amphibian, the YouTube channel with the same name. And we're all about outdoor keeping and advancing the way that we can keep outdoors, as well as breeding and conserving European reptiles and amphibians, especially in Britain, where we're very depleted of our natural species of herptile. A project we were working on recently was the Britain's Lost Turtle production. There was a collaboration of many different people to help start that conversation about how we can make our landscapes wilder by using the hobby and captive populations to start reintroducing. Some of the projects we're working on at the moment include actually breeding animals to a point where we can start releases, and that is one of the things we're now looking into for next year, is formal reintroductions into the wild. There's a lot of secrecy around the project at the moment, but we'll be announcing more information to come. But it's really exciting.
Okay, great. And if anyone is interested in more information on either of these guys, we have individual episodes with each one of you. I think you're all within the 50s. I'll put it in the show notes as well, just the link. But you guys are all within the between 50 and 57 or 58 number episodes. So I can put those. You guys can go listen to that. Let's jump into our first topic, which is bioactivity. And this is a topic that we've discussed before kind of privately, and I had some listeners. Dirk, if you're listening, thank you so much. You have a couple of good suggestions. talking about bioactivity and sort of whether or not it is the godsend of reptile care, which is somewhat turning out to be over time here as it starts to become more mainstream, we can call it, within the reptile world. People are using the term bioactive, I think maybe fairly loosely, and there could be some dangers associated with that as well. So why don't I'll just set it like that and we can just ramble on from there. Does anyone want to jump in with their thoughts?
I suppose we should really start with, because there will be some people listening who don't know, but a very brief idea of what bioactivity is in core concept. And really, bioactivity is nothing more than the introduction of, I suppose you could just say, organisms to the enclosure that you've got your reptile or amphibian living in, that are aside from that reptile and amphibian. So typically the very, very basic level bioactive enclosure will just have some invertebrates introduced to that substrate. So it might just be a particular type of isopod or woodlouse, or you might also have some earthworms, or you might have, in a drier setup, you might have mealworms in as well. And the idea behind this is that they are going to consume the waste of the reptile or amphibian, and that is basically going to keep the enclosure clean for you. Now, earlier on I said organisms rather than just saying straight up inverts, because there is sort of the idea, which is probably something we'll talk about, that a bioactive enclosure does also need to have living plants going in it for the uptake of the nutrients that are going to ultimately build up in that enclosure. That is for it to be a successful ecosystem. But really in the core general concept is a bioactive enclosure is a normal one, but with inverts stuck in it and some substrate that will allow them to breed and so on, like soil rather than aspen or paper towels or anything like that.
Does anyone have anything to jump in or add on to that before we get in further?
One of the things that I like to add to that is, coming from an outdoor perspective, is whether, we don't introduce anything other than plants, and sometimes we don't even go that far. Sometimes we just let the enclosures grow. To what extent do you class sort of sitting on your backside and doing nothing as bioactive? And this is one of the things that I've been trying to work out is, what do we class? Do we class the act of introducing these species as bioactive, or do we class the process, as in the different natural processes these organisms provide, whether it be plants or the inverts? And it's a really interesting way of looking at it, because bioactive, it isn't really a scientific definition of a way of keeping animals, but it is really interesting if you actually have a look into, well, why do we add invertebrates? Why do we need to add plants? And sometimes go as far as I saw Liam was discussing, adding plants from the region that the animal's from. And it's a really interesting discussion when you have to consider the processes that are involved with bioactivity and recreation. And that's where I'm just going to jump straight in and say, one of the criticisms I have of the system, the ideology, is that it can be an oversimplification of what actually goes on in the wild. Which in some sense is a good thing, because it means that the average reptile keeper who's maybe not specialized or has just a couple of species or maybe even one species can sort of get an all-in-one package and have pretty good husbandry if all the parameters are in place. But at the same time, if you look at the outdoor perspective, how we keep our animals, the differences between bioactive and outdoor keeping are stark. There are other abiotic factors such as wind, which are not accounted for in a bioactive system. So I do think that it's a step towards better keeping, but is it a holistic view of keeping? No, I don't think it is at this current stage, but it is a great foundation for which we can improve care.
I see sort of the thing you're aiming at there, which is something I've thought is like this sort of bioactivity is sort of in concept thought to be an ecosystem in a box.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
as you say, it's like just detritivores don't really define an ecosystem. So I know some people have suggested like you might introduce other vertebrates. Say, for example, you've got some arboreal reptile, but rather than just turning the soil through earthworms, you might have some sort of burrowing toad or something that is turning over the soil to a greater degree. And of course, you know, you might you'll have microorganisms, bacteria and things doing the nitrogen cycle, and you might have like saprobiontic fungi acting as well. So yeah, like this idea that you can encapsulate an entire ecosystem in wood lice doesn't really work.
The one thing I want to add to this as well is that people need to realise that bioactive doesn't equate good welfare.
Yeah.
The functionality of the enclosure is far more important than whether it has isopods or not in it. That's the one issue. That's the one issue I take with it, is that people are so obsessed with bioactive because they equate it with being like this higher level keeper, and in some ways it is, because it is quite difficult to get it right. But they just think that because it's bioactive, that means that the animal has great care, and that's not the case.
Yeah, there is this danger of oversimplifying it, and kind of making the assumption, like we're saying, like you throw a couple isopods in there in a plant, and you're almost tricking people into thinking they've created some sort of ecosystem, and sort of what we're alluding to here is it's way more complicated than that. It's almost this analogy that just popped into my head. It would almost be like painting Mona Lisa by like paint by numbers. Like you're just like the resolution is just never going to be there. You could add maybe 10% of the outside world into your enclosure, but it's never going to be an ecosystem. So you can't just add a few isopods and add a plant and then assume the welfare has increased.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one thing that I think it needs plants. If you think you're going to just chuck isopods and springtails into a substrate, there is no nitrogen take up from those plants. So you're just they're breaking down that animal's feces, yes, into smaller components, but then it's just a build-up of those insects' frass in the enclosure.
It's like having a fish tank and not doing a water change. Just let those nitrates go up and up and up. You
get those people brag that, oh, I've never changed my substrate in over a year now because I'm bioactive and it's the best thing ever. Well, that probably is the case if they have a planted enclosure, but if you don't have plants in that enclosure and it isn't actually functioning in that nitrogen cycle, then you're just getting a big dusty frass bowl.
And even if you do have plants, because a mistake that I made early on years ago with my crested gecko is I just use like cocoa fiber or what was called like cocoa core or whatever for the substrate, and you see that all the time on YouTube. Hey, you just throw some coconut husk in there or coconut fiber, and then there's your substrate. You can plant plants in it and whatnot. But that causes a tremendous amount of sulfur buildup and ammonia buildup because nothing's happening in that soil. Yeah. There's nothing else breaking down in the soil, and the plants aren't really using it. So there is lines to be drawn for sure. And
one of the other things that I'd say, building on sort of, it's an overgeneralization of a really complex habitat, is that there are quite a lot of animals where they're coming from regions which are actually quite arid, quite unproductive, and so it's not, how realistic, for instance, is it to have a leopard gecko living with tropical isopods in a soil which is cycling at the speed of a tropical rainforest? Because I've seen the same species of inverts being used no matter where the animal comes from that's being housed in the system. So how realistic is it that we are providing a leopard gecko which comes from an array of habitats with something that maybe does not fit what in the wild it's naturally used to, at least the nutrient cycling aspect? And likewise with say king snakes and things, when they're coming from the arid deserts, how accurate is it to have really nitrogen rich soils, as we say, building up over time and then living in that sort of substrate?
I think it does have to come back to functionality. I mean, at the end of the day, some of it, like you said about having not the exact type of insect in that enclosure. To the animal, it probably doesn't make a difference whether that's the correct species of isopod. It does come down to like themes. I mean, like I've got my moss mantis bioactive, and I've sourced Southeast Asian plants because I want to do that theme, but it doesn't make any difference to the mantis. Yeah. Although there are cases where that is true. I mean, Solomon Island skinks, monkey-tailed skinks, pothos makes up a big part of their diet. So there's cases where it's true and not true.
But one of the points I'd add is I would be willing to bet that going non-bioactive but still providing substrate like you do with your Mexican black king snake is probably more in line with the natural habitat than having 15 centimeters of soil with earthworms that's damp, that's cycling nutrients incredibly quickly, if you understand what I'm saying. So
I know what you're saying.
Do you know what I'm saying?
If you've got say, for example, a temperate forest environment, then you've got a huge number of invertebrates breaking down leaf litter, and you've got fungi, and you've got this really nice, thick, productive humus being formed. Whereas if you've got an animal from a sandy desert as the complete opposite extreme, then they aren't, the habitat for which they have adapted and evolved isn't that nutrient rich, sort of continually being changed over, decomposing biological mass that is the humus of more productive zones. But I suppose going into that, we do have to sort of ask the question of how much that actually matters for the animal, because if you were thinking about plants, for example, we know that, like, you know, keep from my own keeping of houseplants, if you try and keep a cactus in an environment that suits a jungle plant, well, it doesn't really work out, because the environment that it's adapted to, evolved to function in, is, you know, completely different soil quality. Whether that actually applies to the health and well-being of a reptile or amphibian, I don't know, but I understand where you're coming from, and it's definitely something that I suppose we should probably think about.
Yeah, and it's probably important to say that we're not discouraging bioactive at all. Like, I have a few bioactive enclosures. I know Joe does as well, and obviously Liam does.
All of them.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not that we're saying we shouldn't be doing it, but it is something that's almost taking a weird tilt at this point, where people are using it as a way to sort of level up their care without actually thinking about it. And so it's tough, because you want to encourage people to think that way. But I think you're right, whoever one of you guys had said it, that the question is, does it matter to the animal? And that's the first question we want to answer. And if it's actually negative to the animal, then we don't want to do it. If it's neutral to the animal, then I think as the keeper, you want to just be able to do what you can manage successfully, that's not going to get out of hand on your, and what you're getting enjoyment out of, as long as it's a neutral experience for the animal. And then obviously there's the positive experience. So what positive experience can come from keeping an animal in bioactive enclosure, if any, besides the enrichment of the plants?
So this is some of the things that I thought about what I wanted to do in my animals, and why I decided to not go bioactive with the MBKs, or Mexican black king snakes. The benefits of a bioactive enclosure are, in some ways, it can be easier for the keeper, because you're doing less soil changes and less maintenance. Another benefit is better air quality, because the plants in there are obviously doing their thing. They're, in terms of like, for the actual animal and the welfare and functionality, I don't think there's that much to it.
I can think of the main one I can think of for the animals is the stability in the environment. So if you've got like a territorial animal, or an animal that's like set scent trails and is used to its environment, then if you haven't got to have that constant in-out flux of fresh soil, where it's basically resetting the environment, it's effectively relocating the animal to a new territory, then having that like the stable scents and smells in there is beneficial. But no, for me, the real driver for going bioactive is you can set up an environment that is really complex and not worry about having to take it apart. So that Western green lizard enclosure I did is the best example, really, is that to clean it would be an absolute nightmare. That just to set that up and clean it, it's just never going to happen. There's got to be some cheat, and the cheat is bioactivity. Plus, there's you could also argue that having the ability to like rummage and hunt is an additional benefit, because I do see like darkling beetles, for example. My bearded dragon will love when one of those pops up out the substrate. He's straight on that, eating it. And the green lizards can rummage through the leaf litter and catch invertebrates. And I have also seen, in one case, me leopard geckos. This I thought this was fantastic. I never expected it. It's in the substrate where the mealworm pupae were. In a previous setup I had, my male leopard gecko, I just saw him just digging one time, and he dug straight down and found the pupa underneath the soil and like dug it up and ate it. So there is like a sort of an enrichment hunting gathering aspect in there, but so there are, what I'm saying really is there are real benefits to bioactivity for the animals, I think, and there's that secondary benefit of allowing you to go more complex in the enclosure setup. But in like the core principle, going from not bioactive to bioactive isn't the hugest leap. You can still have a crap setup and have it bioactive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've seen the if you look on YouTube, it would just be hognose snake bioactive rack. I mean, for the animal's welfare, that's still shocking in being in a rack. So bioactivity makes no difference to it. It's interesting the point you make about how constant environment and scent trails and stuff. That's something that I have been talking with Laurie with recently, and instead of doing one big full clean once a month, I'm actually doing partial changes every 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So there's still some old substrate in there constantly with the same scent.
Yeah, I do that as well. And I think there are two quick things I'll say before I let Harvey jump in. One, having live plants without invertebrates is not bioactive, but that would still be beneficial to the animal, obviously, including some live plants. So we're not that. I guess you would classify, if we're going to define things, that would be as naturalistic. And I also don't write off the experience of the keeper interacting with a more complex enclosure and having fun setting it up and having some reward, like self-reward of setting up a complex bioactive enclosure. There is some serious benefit to that as a keeper, just some self-satisfying, as long as it's going about it the right way. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it at all, and neither of us are saying that, but I think that's a really important thing as well, as long as it's not just throwing 5 isopods in there and calling it a day. So Harvey, you can jump in.
What we'd say at least in the north in Britain is, in regards to the bioactive hognose rack, it's about as useful as a chocolate teapot, really.
I always say that here.
And to be honest, and that's one of the criticisms you can have of bioactivity, is it's almost become this fad where if people attach their name to it, therefore it equals good husbandry. And as we know, that is not the case. You can have an awful setup and it have a few inverts and a few plants in there. And so I think that's one of the criticisms of this whole sort of movement, is that instead of considering the process and what we need to happen in a captive system, people are almost opting for this sort of fashion-like fad, in which you may not be able to understand or exploit the processes that you need, the nutrient cycles that you need in a vivarium, for instance. So that is, and you can see it quite a lot in sort of AHH and other groups where maybe inexperienced keepers saying, "Oh, I'm bioactive," and the setup does not fit the species in question at all. but because they're given this sort of full sense of security that because it's bioactive, it's therefore suited to that animal. And we know that that's not the case. And more that we advance the way that we keep these species, are we realizing that these sort of specifications that we give to different species are never fixed, and we need to be careful if we're considering bioactivity as this sort of groundbreaking next advancement in the hobby, which it isn't, in many different respects.
Yeah, it kind of acts as a get out of jail free card in a way. Like you just throw that term in there and you're good to go.
Yeah, it is sort of. I think this is really what we're trying to point out here, is that bioactivity is good, bioactivity is useful, but bioactivity isn't the pinnacle of reptile keeping. You don't go from not bioactive to bioactive and you've got the best enclosure ever. You could have that hognose in a rack, which is incredibly too small, has got no lighting at all, or you could have something that is, an absolutely enormous hognose enclosure with loads of live plants in it, loads of branches, loads of different hiding opportunities. Perhaps it's even so large that you might have a number in there for social interaction, or you might have several separate enclosures and get that social interaction into the animal's life, which is not something people talk about with reptiles, but is a real thing that I think is going to start being talked about more. And I don't know if I said this already, but you could have, you could basically have the sun as your only lighting, but they're both bioactive enclosures and one's better than the other. So it's just taming expectations, I think, really, of you go bioactive, okay, what else?
Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be your end goal. We can put it that way.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think people need to... I wish keepers were more aware of how to measure welfare and what the actions you can do actually affect the animal. Like, you mentioned welfare and people lose their minds because they associate it with animal rights. I know we've made videos on like welfare in the past, but it's still like a taboo topic.
Yes, it is. People hate that term and they get afraid of it, but and reptiles are particularly difficult to read their welfare just kind of by watching them. If you're not familiar with the animal, they're very stoic, right? They can kind of carry disease very well, and it can be confusing to keepers if they're not actually recognizing a sick animal, and it could be sick due to the fact that they've thrown in a few isopods and there's a really damp environment, and they think it's bioactive, and so the animal should be healthier, but maybe they're actually decreasing its welfare.
Yeah, it's almost pernicious in effect that if people get it into the heads that bioactivity is absolutely brilliant, then if you've got a bearded dragon in an unlit box with a soggy damp substrate, that's not going to do very well. But as a complete extrapolation, really, because it's a bit of an over exaggeration. But if somebody does get it in the head that you go bioactive and that's the golden ticket, then it's not good for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just thought of an analogy, and I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to try it.
Let's try it out.
So let's say a functioning enclosure is a car, and bioactivity is turbo boost. Just because you have turbo boost does not mean the car functions properly.
Yeah.
Yes, it will do certain things for you. Not everybody needs a turbo boost on their Volkswagen Golf, right? So that is a pretty good analogy. It's one of those things where and also if you're putting a turbo on your car, you probably want to have a really good understanding of how the engine works and what is that piece of equipment doing for the engine. It's not just throw it on and then crash into a light post because you don't know how to control it. And I think that's actually pretty good.
Car's got to turn on first, let alone have a turbo.
Yeah, you can't start with the turbo.
I think like even the bioactive racks, people think that it equates good welfare. Well, if we actually go through welfare, we pick it apart. You can pick racks apart to the point where it's not even acceptable by any means. Like And then you get the argument saying, well, they're still alive, that means it's fine. Like, let's take the argument of snakes and UVB. So there's studies on certain species where the 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels go up after being exposed to UVB. Now, so you can make that case and say, well, therefore, snakes need UVB because they gain D3 from it. Well, people are going to say, well, oh, my raw python in Iraq has got all the D3 it needs because it's eating it through dietary means. Well, no. Every single snake given UVB in these studies has a significant spike in 25-hydroxyvitamin D. If the snake's already at a good level of D3, it doesn't spike because subcutaneous use of UVB, it has a cutoff point when it's had enough. So if you're already near your good levels, near your cutoff point, you're not going to get a massive spike, are you? You might see a little bit of a rise and like taper along, but the fact that there's such a massive spike means that the animal is deficient in D3. But it's still alive. Okay, that's okay then. Well, 1 billion people in the world are estimated to be deficient in vitamin D3. They're still alive, but are they healthy? No, they're not healthy.
Yeah, I think a lot of our problem as well with saying what is a healthy animal and what isn't is that people's idea of a healthy animal is not a healthy animal, because we're in a very infant hobby really, and our understanding of even the technology that we've got is only just coming to the point where we're learning how to use it. Certainly with lighting, which is an incredibly important thing for all reptiles, I would argue. But what I was saying is that if we come from this background of taking things as it's feeding, it's defecating. I got some young out of it last year. So basically, the thing is alive is equated to healthy. Well, it doesn't really work like that. I mean, you can have dogs in puppy mills that are kept in atrocious conditions, and they'll feed and they'll defecate and they'll breed every year. It doesn't mean that that's good welfare, and it doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do. We need to be like taking a step back and like actually thinking about what it is that we are doing and taking as the signs of health, rather than just assuming, these basic things of feed, defecate, breed, those three things alone don't equate to health. And so when we look at things like racks and see that those things are filled out, it doesn't mean that we've got the most fulfilled animal in the world.
It's interesting you say comparing them to puppy mills. I mean, I compare it to puppy mills because they are comparable, but you see people say, that's a straw man argument. Well, really, if we take the Animal Welfare Act, you've got the need for a suitable environment and the need to be able to express natural behaviours. Considering scientific literature now has criticised the Animal Welfare Act for being too basic, and that only allows the animal to meet basic welfare and not even good or great welfare. So, racking system. Snake can just sit there in most cases. Fails both of those scenarios. Can't express natural behaviours. Doesn't have access to a natural environment. Puppy mill. Fails that again. Both of them fail the basic needs of welfare. So they are entirely comparable. Mm-hmm. People don't realise that because they can't assess welfare.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. When you think about it logically, it's hard to get around that fact. And it's just sort of an ignorance to the animal's potential, not only on the welfare side, but also just on a behavioral side. If you're ignorant to those two things, then it's easy to say, well, it just sits here and doesn't do anything anyway, so why would I offer it more? But if you've never actually interacted with the animal when it's really healthy, has lots of energy, and is willing and has the option to exhibit different things and different behaviors, then it really opens up a new world.
I think an example which I'll mention, I suppose I've not asked his permission to mention his name, So should I? Well, I'll use it. I'll use this example, and you'll know who
if
he
you want
is
to use his name, and
if
you second guess yourself later, like again, it's not live, so I can beep.
Okay. Well, Francis Koscieri talks about the European eyed lizards, which Tom's got, and he says, I'll try and quote him as correctly as I can, but he says about how he kept them indoors, and compared to the lizards that he would see out in the wild, around the Iberian Peninsula, and within the natural range of eyed lizards, the difference between those wild animals and the captive ones in terms of coloration and activity just made him think that this isn't how these should be kept. Yeah. If you're going to keep them, they belong outside as you have them at Celtic. So, I suppose you could probably talk a bit more about this than me, Harvey. But it's this idea of we've got them indoors and we're using the indoor environment as our baseline ideal for what we think they should be like. It doesn't really work like that.
And that's one of the things I'll add is that the animals that we keep, we're lucky enough to literally either the habitat being just up the road or just being a short flight away or a ferry crossing away. And some of these more exotic species and rare species, take for instance the crocodile monitor, we cannot be actively comparing the wild with the captive husbandry of these animals. So it's going to be, just in eyed lizards, and I've seen the difference. I haven't seen eyed lizards in the wild, but I've seen the photographs, and I can speak of western green lizards in the wild compared to in captivity. The difference is unbelievable. But that is because we've got, these animals live fairly close to civilization, are readily accessible. You imagine what some of these species that are, hard to find in the wild or unassessed for their conservation value in the wild, what differences there could be between a Southeast Asian jungle and, indoor in a vivarium in Britain. So it's always going to be hard to assess welfare from literally a spatial perspective. But I don't think that should stop us from trying to improve at all times. But the point I'm trying to get to is that is the benefit of keeping animals which are relatively native, is you can go out and collect literally primary data for how the animals behave. So, for instance, a great measure that I've been reading about a lot recently has been the movement of different species of reptile in their natural habitat, to see what sort of range these animals have. Smooth snakes, for instance, which is a species we've just acquired, have a range of about the size of a tennis court. And so when we're genuinely thinking about welfare, and yes, we could be dealing with the fact that its source of food is, on one corner, its source of water is on another, its sort of hide, and we can bunch all that together in a captive situation. Enclosure size is one of those things that we actually could be possibly way off in terms of, what we need to provide our animals. And like I said to Joe, green lizards, I've seen them basking in trees. They'll climb up into trees. And this is an animal which is not listed as arboreal anywhere, but will live in trees, but then also have burrows under the soil. Likewise with Aesculapian snakes, which are a European species. They are incredibly arboreal, incredibly good climbers, yet at the same time dig a network of burrows in their enclosure that go down quite deep. So we kind of, in a way, in a way of putting them in an enclosure, a smaller space, we are simplifying the husbandry. And this is one of the discussions I've had before. Anything that we bring into captivity is always going to be a simplification of the wild. We can never 100% recreate the wild. That's just one of the facts of captivity. Even if we could, logistically, economically, we couldn't do it, especially even establishments such as zoos, because it all depends on priority. And that's like, for instance, our lacerted raising rack is not rack, but system or whatever, is a very simplified sort of setup for these animals. The reason being is because that is not their eventual placement. They're only in there for 3 months and then moved outside. And the whole point is, if we can grow them bigger and get them nice and big, nice and quick, they can go outside and have a better lifestyle, as it were, outside than going outside from day one, if that makes sense. So it's all about what our priorities are in a system, but at the same time, we've got to be constantly cross-checking with the latest research from the wild. And I think that the eyed lizard example is a great testament to just how different these animals can be. But the only way we found out the difference is because they're an animal which is relatively accessible to anyone who lives in Europe, not necessarily, say, a crocodile monitor, which we until recently we thought was a myth, in the jungles of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, jumping back to your former point about Aesculapian snakes being like all-terrain vehicles. Well, something that's really close to home and is like, well, I've noticed personally, and lots of viewers, it's got direct meaning for them because they'll keep this species, is bearded dragons in terms of being arboreal and digging burrows. So earlier on this year, something I showed in my videos was adding some larger branches to my bearded dragon's enclosure. Now before that, he basically never had the opportunity to climb because I did have some branches in there, but they were nowhere near big enough for him to be comfortable clinging onto. So he just didn't. But since I've added those branches, his habits of where he sleeps every single night have completely changed. What he used to do was he would find a dark corner, dig in his substrate, bury himself, and then he would come up mid-morning the next day. So I would assume from that behaviour that what they would do in the wild was dig burrows, sleep down them, and come up during the day. But since adding the branches, what I've found out is that every single night he sleeps up the branches. So if we are just looking in a 5 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot box, which is my bearded dragon's enclosure, and you haven't, that is never going to be furnished like the wild. There's some branches in there, but as far as my dragon's concerned, they're literally about a foot off the ground. How am I going to know what his interactions are with a full-scale tree are going to be? The substrate in his enclosure is a few inches thick. How am I going to know how deep a bearded dragon digs a burrow? If we take all these things, and I didn't put those branches in, and I saw he didn't go on the little thin twigs I had for him, and I just decided, okay, bearded dragons don't climb. Well, the whole thing is wrong. We can only learn from these animals in the wild, not just make up some pseudo setting that is basically pushing them into behaving a particular way and assuming that is the way they're meant to be. It's we've got to think literally outside the box.
I mean, ball pythons or raw pythons are the most perfect example of that. They're the most shafted reptile in the hobby.
Without a doubt. A
species that goes and sits in a tree in that same coiled, looped position as a green tree python gets shoved in a rack. Now, yes. I don't want to say too much because I've made a video on it now. I don't know when this when does this podcast come out?
It'll probably come out a week and a couple days from today. So if your video is out next week, it will be already out for the listeners.
Okay, so I'll just say the video that I've got coming out is I've got direct comparisons of raw pythons sat in a tree in the same positions as green tree pythons. I've got studies.
Corn snakes do it as well.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many. I downloaded 100 images of raw pythons climbing just to make a point that people have already shown it happens in captivity. Yet, but if you only expose yourself to groups that keep ball pythons in a rack, then all you're going to see is a ball python in the rack.
Yeah, Yeah, there is that sort of nature versus nurture thing that goes on here when we confine the reptile to an environment that only gives them two options of things to do, then that's all they're going to do, and then that's all we think they do, which is the wrong thinking. And I would say if you're not thinking keeping reptiles in your home is unethical at least once a month, you're probably not thinking about reptile care deep enough. You know, like conversations like this really make me start to think like, God, the further we walk down this path, the harder it is to keep them, and the more intense you want to be with the understanding of the animal, and you want to be much better on the care, because it's easy to take this path all the way to the point where maybe we shouldn't be keeping them at all, especially when you start talking about, you know, an enclosure the size of a tennis court. Like, that's the size of my apartment. You know, like you start wondering if it's, and I know there are great reasons to keep animals in captivity. We talk about it on the podcast all the time, but you certainly want those gears to be turning to ensuring that the animals that we do have at home are experiencing as much as we can provide them.
Well, one of the things that that we're planning is building an enclosure that is the size of basically, we don't know which species, but there's like 5 we can pick. Basically, building an enclosure the size of the animals in question's territory in the wild, and then actually actively comparing the differences between those in a smaller sort of normal outdoor enclosure size, which, to be honest, is already generous compared to what you'd be providing indoors. Because it would be interesting to see whether, because I've got an idea that the reason why they need such a large area is because obviously resources aren't as diverse as we can provide in an indoor setup. So, for instance, you know, if you think about a water source, for instance, I was reading about smooth snakes. They usually go down to peat bogs to drink. So you've got to think a peat bog is like in the sort of dip of a valley in a heath. So therefore, you're going to have to move quite far away from a basking site, which is like on a nice exposed area of the heath, to drink. And then food again might be on the edge of a forest, say if we're looking for common lizards. So you've got to move again. So my question is the territory that big because the animals have got to move to collect resources, or is it that big because literally everything in that space is being used by the animal? And so that's one of the things that we'll look into when this project goes ahead, whether it be next year, I don't know, but definitely the year after. It'll be really interesting to just see whether just contrast and compare the differences between sort of a usual setup and a realistic setup. That being said, whether we can even observe the animal in a tennis court with the size, you know, a common lizard being that big, but who knows? It'd be interesting.
It is worth pointing out there that even if you did have all of the things in a smaller space, it doesn't. There's still that. If the amount of space that the animals use in the wild is typical, you know, for what they've actually evolved for, it's not like a recent product of man changing the environment. But if that is a true representation of what they have evolved to utilise, then even if they could have it smaller, then I think there's still some argument for having that larger size. Because, for example, I could have everything I needed in this room. I could have an oven over there. I could have a fridge. I could have all my food brought in online from Sainsbury's.
You wish.
You could have your set of dumbbells in the corner to get ripped.
Stop that.
Now you're going too far.
No, but you could have everything you needed in the room, but in a day I would be just going mad. I'd be needing to go out for a walk. Yeah. You know, people with hamsters or whatever. You put a wheel in there because even though they've got all the food and water and stuff they need where they are, they still want to run. You know, there are videos out there on the internet of leopard geckos using hamster wheels. You know, just space.
Yeah,
is something we need to provide.
That is something. Oh, go ahead, Harvey.
Oh, is that okay? One of the things I'll just jump in there and say though is one of the worst animals that we keep welfare wise is people. So, for instance, hunter gatherers would, on average, walk about 30 to 35 kilometers a day, run and walk. And no one even on this call will get anywhere close to that. You know, you'd have to devote 6 hours a day at least to exercise. And that figure isn't sort of including weightlifting, you know, moving resources back to camp, whatever. So in a way, I think everyone at least on this call, I hope, has a good welfare, has a good happiness level. So
well, I am a bit fat.
There's a little bit of awkward pause there. So what the point I'm trying to make is, do we need to walk 32 kilometers a day to be happy and healthy? Do we need to have a territory of 100 square miles? No. And my point is similar to, you know, the animals out in the wild. Do they need as much of an area to demonstrate purely natural behavior? I don't think so, but then I don't know. So it's an interesting question when you consider what is that space utilization going to look like? And this is, I really do, and I can legally do this. I really want to go and catch just a common lizard, fit it with a radio tracker, which you can do completely legally, and then just put it back in the wild and just see what its sort of like distribution looks like. So then I've got my own data that I've collected that I can then take and you know, build an enclosure from, because I think that it would be really genuinely interesting to see what sort of the space, call it that, the space utilization is like of these animals, whether it is literally every piece of land that's in their territory is used, or whether, you know, it is just for resource collection. So it would be a really interesting study to do. But yeah,
that comes down. This comes down to.
Do you go on?
This comes down to the actual individual animal's fitness as well. I mean, take bearded dragons. There's so much footage of them in trees, and babies are. You keep babies in captivity, and you have the cage guard. And where are the babies in pet shops? Clinging to the cage guard, because they're at that stage they are more arboreal. But I spoke to someone recently about, I wanted to build like a 6 foot high, 6 foot long bearded dragon enclosure and allow it to climb. It's just, I mean, they occupy the same sort of heights and areas in the wild as field dragons do. And the person in the pet shop said to me, well, they aren't made to climb, they're just going to fall and hurt themselves. I was like, he said they won't have the same muscle development to climb. I said, well, if you put a field dragon in a completely flat enclosure and then suddenly, after a year, put it in a big enclosure, it's going to be awful at climbing because it hasn't got those muscles developed to climb. Same thing for a beardie. When someone says to you, oh, a beardie's arboreal, and then you give it a massive tree, that beardie is going to be awful at climbing because it has no muscle development for that activity. Same thing with when I tell people that raw pythons in the wild are semi-arboreal. Now, if you're a rat keeper, that ball python, or raw python, we want to say, is going to have the worst muscle development in the world. So when they're like, oh, okay, I'll test it, and they're like, see, it didn't climb, well...
Or fell off.
It's fat and lazy and has no muscle. What do you expect?
Yeah.
Like,
it's interesting you say that, because when we first set up the European tree frog breeding group, we raised some of the animals indoors in just a little sort of ectoterra, just to get them bigger because they were tiny. And when I first put them out into so it was a fruit cage design to start off with, and I put them out into the sort of the enclosure, and they were awful at climbing. Like, there was a big fig tree in the middle. They were awful at climbing. I mean, they kept falling off to the ground. I mean, that's not great, is it? But they kept falling off to the ground. But after about a week, they did start to develop and climb. And this is an animal which is literally nearly 100% arboreal. Yet, you know, if you keep it in a smaller setup where it doesn't have those abilities to climb, it won't be able to climb. So it makes perfect sense that if you keep an animal in a sort of flat enclosure, literally, then it won't be able to express those sort of natural behaviors. And that's another point, actually, thinking about. Not only are we talking about physical muscle development, what about sort of behavioral, mental development? So behaviors which animals need to learn, sometimes socially. I mean, and I know that reptiles and amphibians aren't necessarily the most social of all animals, but there will be certain behaviors that animals randomly learn that maybe we don't give them the opportunity in simplistic setups.
Me and Liam have another collab coming out about that soon to do with leopard geckos, which we won't spoil. But there are papers out there talking about learned social behaviour. In leopard geckos, and but yeah, let's not go down that route just yet.
Well, and it's interesting the going back to Harvey's example of the hunter gatherer tribes, walking 30 to 35 kilometers a day and being very fit compared to most people now. Although if you were to take a modern day athlete, they would be so much more healthier and more fit than somebody who is a hunter gatherer. So there is that potential of having an artificial setting that can exploit the natural biology of a being and make them stronger and better than they would be in the wild. So that is what we could actually strive for in captivity in a way. We could actually make these animals healthier by providing proper nutrition, proper enrichment, proper muscle development than they would potentially be in the wild.
Well, that's the whole point about captivity, isn't it? And like Mariah's video is brilliant. We have to take away the negatives, but also we can't have something that's just neutral. We have to have something that actually benefits and adds to the animal.
Exactly.
And I think like a prime example is like most polar bears in the wild now, at least, unfortunately, due to climate change and habitat loss, are malnourished. I think the majority of the population is now malnourished, and that they've been that way for quite a while. And obviously you wouldn't want that happening in captivity. And so you would provide them with a more balanced diet, which would allow them to reach a better weight so they can obviously breed in captivity if that's the aim. So yeah, I think that is a very important point. We need to almost have a mindset where we improve upon the wild, but not sort of downplay some of the crucial and important factors which determine a healthy animal that are already in place in the wild.
Strip away the negatives of the wild, but make sure you don't strip away the positives with them.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Almost, and in a further addition to that, strip away the negatives of the wild without stripping away the positives, but also introduce the positives of captivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I want to take us back to, I know we've kind of gone off a little bit away from the bioactive. There's one more thing we're kind of touching.
As we usually do.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Every week.
Yeah. I'm happy to do that, but I want to just touch on two other issues before we continue down, because we're kind of in that realm right now, introducing the negatives of the wild and whatnot, or trying to avoid that. One of the points that was sent to me by one of the listeners, again, this was Dirk, that he had sent me an email, was, because bioactive as a term is being, thrown around willy-nilly, people tend to just add plants, add leaf litter and all these things without thinking about it, or add isopods. There, something like oak leaves, for example, are considered toxic, and pothos even is considered toxic. They have, calcium oxalate crystals in them that, other than the Solomon Island skink, are actually considered toxic for most animals. And people are adding these into the enclosures, and I have too. I have pothos in most of my enclosures, and I've never even really thought about it before. So, are there dangers with us not identifying these negatives well enough? Like we're just going, oh, you can throw leaf litter in your enclosure without realizing that we might be adding some sort of irritant or even poison. You want to jump in, Harvey?
Yeah, one of the things that I'll say is, Joe, when we did the collaboration on the green lizard enclosure, Joe, do you still have that what is it? The oleander, is it, that's in there? No, azalea.
The plants.
Yeah, it's the azalea.
Yeah, I've got the azalea.
It's still in there. One of the things Joe said is, it's a very toxic plant, actually. But the thing that I was saying is we've got toxic plants in the outdoor enclosures. But the point that I was trying to make to Joe is they're toxic if you take a reductionist point of view and say that single chemical in that plant is the toxic part, but you don't consider the fact that the insects that maybe feed on that plant digest that molecule, or the leaves that fall start to decompose and the molecule breaks down. So just taking that one aspect of whatever factor it is that's bad on its own may be a negative, but in all actuality, you're not considering the complex nature of the whole system, whereby there are other processes which make that either neutral or even beneficial. So, there's the chance that, different molecules within the plants may be toxic, but once modified could help in, whether they go through the intestinary tract of an insectivorous reptile or amphibian or whatever, and actually benefit the animal if they're slightly modified. And that's one of the problems, again, when we're talking about we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater almost. We can't, get rid of the negatives as well as the positives. We've got to take more of a holistic view rather than a reductionist, that single pot is negative, let's get rid of it, because often it's all interlinked in a way that we can't often imagine.
The thought that I had to that question as well was, let's say Pothos toxic, and you've got an insectivorous reptile in there which eats isopods now and again. Those isopods are going to have to be constantly feeding on that Pothos to even equate to like that amount of toxicity reaching the reptile. Now, isopods are detritivores, so they only eat decaying organic matter. Well, what proportion of those living plants in there are decaying? Very, very little. So unless the animal was ingesting huge amounts by actually biting into the actual leaf, I doubt there's actually that much toxicity like working its way up to the reptile anyway.
Mm-hmm. Joe, do you have anything to say on that?
There's going to be outliers anyway, but
yeah, the thing with the azaleas, just as a slight tangent, it was one of my viewers, Tristan Simpson, I want to say the username was, so free shout out for you. But they pointed out to me that the azalea is highly toxic, so I thought I'd have a look into this. And it actually is. I think rhododendrons are a very closely related plant. They're also highly toxic. And I managed, there were very, very scanty reports of interactions with reptiles. There were lots of things saying if you've got young kids or whatever, don't have an azalea in case they pluck the flowers off and eat them because they'll start vomiting and things like that. But the things I found for reptiles was there was one study, or one experiment really, not a very nice one, where somebody put azalea flowers with green iguanas, and one of the green iguanas was smart enough to look at the flower and completely ignore it and wouldn't go anywhere near it. The other one wasn't really convinced, I don't think, was how it went, but it did eat it. Then its breathing rate increased after half an hour or something. It keeled over, turned black, and regurgitated the flower and took several hours to come to. And then there was another very small report of green iguanas eating parts of azaleas and dying, and also tortoises in gardens having nibbled on bits of azaleas and also dying. So that does seem to be a very real case of a direct ingestion of this plant, at least for green iguanas and whatever tortoises were concerned, is definitely something that wants to be avoided. But, when we're talking about insectivorous reptiles like my western green lizards, well, you've got to think, what's the probability of them ingesting a sufficient quantity of that plant for them to have a problem? Is it a risk or is it not? We could, you'd think it would be sensible to just go for a known safe plant, because then you're not going to have the issue. And I don't really see that you can argue with that. Like, there's not something special that an azalea offers that a non-toxic equivalent wouldn't also offer. So there's definitely that to consider. But in saying that, I also don't want to say wrapping it up in cotton wool, because people do that with substrates. They say substrates could cause impaction, therefore forget all the potential benefits of substrates, forget how slim the risk is of impaction, given that the animal is otherwise in full health. Just don't do it because there's a small risk. Well, there you've got a trade-off. In the case of the plants, it's sort of like you can always have another plant, but it's making the right decision at the right time and thinking about these things and being sensible rather than just, blanket statements.
I mean, this conversation reminds me of... Sorry, who was that?
No, you go.
This conversation reminds me of cats. I mean, cats eat grass and it makes them throw up. And I don't know if the grass is toxic to them or not, but they'll actively seek it out to use it. So there's clearly some benefit to them, whether it's something gastrointestinal or something. But unless you understood that and knew that animal's natural history and had studied that animal, you would say grass is toxic, don't give it to it. But there's clearly some use of that grass.
And I think that's one of the things about animal husbandry in general. It's a science, and science by default is always our best guess. And so, although we love as people, as humans, to have, a 1 to 10 guide of how to look after a royal python or whatever species, it's never going to be that easy, especially with the fact that our knowledge of the animal and its biology and its ecology in the wild is always changing and is always increasing. So, as Joe said, it's always going to be about being sensible and having an informed approach. And I think to some extent, if you set up a new enclosure or you're providing care for an animal, thinking to yourself, I've looked at all the evidence, I've read about this animal, I've researched thoroughly, I've done a really good job, and genuinely being pleased with yourself that you're providing a good enough habitat for that animal. And I think a lot of that relies on this. And I think that's one of the problems. I think that's the beauty, but also one of the problems with the hobby is the fact that it's never going to be, that's how you care for an animal. That's the indefinite, method. So it comes a point, doesn't it, where we have to be sensible and we have to take the best guess, the most informed approach at all times.
Now, I think that is a really good point for us to sort of diverge slightly onto the other topic that we wanted to talk about today, is that with you say there is no 1 to 10 guide of how to keep reptiles. That is what our the collaboration that me, Harvey, Liam, Harvey's counterpart Tom, who's not with us today, Dylan, Laurie Tarini, Mariah Healy, Pete Hawkins, and was there anyone else? Have I missed someone?
Sam
didn't do it.
No, there was 7. I hope you're not missing anyone, but I don't think you are.
All right. Well, if I'm missing someone, sorry. But basically, we did this series, Progressing Your Reptile Care, where the main theme we wanted to get across in this series, which you can still watch.
Go watch it. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yes, please. But the main takeaway we wanted with that is that with reptile care, we want to be ever moving forwards and not just doing what is currently accepted. And this is where I'm heading with all this, is that with us making these videos, it's incredibly important that we convey that message, that what we are doing is not telling you how to care for your reptile, end of. What we're actively trying to do is develop these sorts of debates, these sorts of discussions, because it's from these discussions that you're going to have listened to this. I hope you've got this far in the podcast. If you have, well done. Well done. But if you have got this far, then I'm sure that you've got something to say about what we've said today, whether that's disagreeing, whether that's agreeing completely, whether that's wanting to add a point to your own. As long as we are discussing these things and we aren't just you know, this is what somebody told me is correct. This is what I'm going to do. Everything else is wrong. As long as we have these discussions and are moving forwards, then really I can't see that we're doing the wrong thing. And really, as those people making the videos and having a voice, really, it is our responsibility to make sure that that's what we're doing. I'm not just telling you what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not giving you the cookie cutter. These are the points you have to follow to have success, which I know we see a lot of out there on YouTube. So this does dovetail nicely into our second topic, which if you are still here and you're going, oh my God, this is only the second topic, what's happening here? This is the second topic. So Liam, do you want to just take it from there? I know you've spent some time thinking about this, and then we can probably have another 3 to 4 hours to go here.
Yeah, just keep me under control. I mean, you'll hear that, like, the way Joe describes it, he feels incredibly responsible for what he says and how that ends up being used on an animal. You think that each of us have, what, 500 to 1,000? No. Under 10,000 subscribers, but we get roughly, what, 500 views a video? Let's say each of those 500 people have got 20 reptiles. Let's be honest, very few hobbyists have one reptile. So the very words that you say that person may take to heart can influence the welfare of all the animals in that person's collection. This isn't just one animal per one person that watches a video. So if you escalate that to you having millions upon millions of subscribers, the impact that you have on an animal's life somewhere across the globe is huge. And that's why we find it so important that we're not telling you how to think, but we're putting points across using scientific evidence and providing you with the sources and the science that you can go through and read the papers and make up your own decision after if you really want to. The dangers of what we're doing on YouTube is that the pet tube side of things, that are feeding all my pets and, oh, you just do this, this and this, and what I say is correct, therefore you do this. Well, you got some people saying completely incorrect information and not providing any justification on why that is true, other than the fact that it's their word for it. And you take someone, Brian Barczyk, who most people come across this guy on YouTube, see him with millions of subscribers and think, wow, he must really know what he's doing, especially when he's got all these snakes and his business is for the most part successful, although I know behind the scenes it isn't. But people are going to see that and think, well, he knows what he's talking about, I'm going to listen to him. And the responsibility that man has is ridiculous, and I don't think he actually realises it, but he's telling people to keep a snake in a rack. And the same goes for even people slightly smaller than them. You've got 100,000 subscribers. Well, the amount of animals that you're influencing is huge. You got, like, Kevin McCurley from Nerd. He made those videos almost taking the piss out of someone for saying, give an animal a larger enclosure. He had 2 bins, and he had 3 sizes. The biggest one was far too small for the species he wanted to keep in there. And then he said this one is too big. And he went to the next one and said this one's too big. And the smallest tiny little box, he's like, this one's perfect, because they like tight spaces. And that is so damaging to welfare. It's ridiculous. The amount of people that will look at that and then go and tell someone else that because they've learnt this new thing. And there's this thing in the reptile industry where everyone has to feel the need to be authoritative. Everyone's like a genius. Everyone wants to be Steve Irwin. So as soon as they learn something, they go give someone else advice, and they're parroting this poor advice from this person that is incorrect in the first place. And this, I'll try not to swear, this misinformation gets spread around the industry when it's not true.
Yeah, there with a risk of for smaller channels looking like we're jealous and sad about not having more subscribers, because and that's not what this is. encourage everybody to go watch on Netflix. There's the documentary Social Dilemma, and also Rogan just did an interview on his podcast with one of the creators. I think the guy's name was Tristan something. It was recent, and it just discusses how these algorithms work on social media as well as YouTube. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. The algorithm has nothing to do with quality of information. Nothing. It's not capable of judging the quality of information. It's capable of judging retention time, like interactions, comments, and things like that. But the quality doesn't come into the equation at all. So you can become popular on YouTube and look like an authoritative figure in that niche, but not have any of the substance that gets you there. The only thing you have is the ability to retain audience for whatever reason. And what tends to retain people is shock value and wow, and even negative. Like that tends to do what does really well on YouTube. Like, oh, all my snakes died. There's your hit. My thing died, whatever. And that draws in audience. And we are fighting an uphill battle trying to provide an open-minded mindset to viewers that doesn't use negative shock value to get there. And it's almost like we're running on a treadmill, and we're gonna get flung off the back at some point.
Well, yeah, it's not about jealousy or about how many subscribers they have. Sure, that would be nice, but you notice we don't mention names like Camp Kennan, because he is doing something correct, so we can't criticize him, even though he has a large following. So it's not about following, it's about someone doing damage to an animal. At the end of the day, that's all I care about, and I'm sure that's all you guys care about as well. Like, I'm not even in my videos because I want the focus to be the animals and not myself. I couldn't care less about myself. I just want to do something positive and make people realize that the industry is in a really bad place for the most part. You get these little pockets where everyone's really advanced and they know what they're doing, they read scientific papers, but for the most part, in terms of welfare, it's shocking. Like, keeping a ball python in a rack is mainstream. Like, that is the common thing practiced. And in terms of welfare, and actually in a scientific point of view, that is absolutely shocking. But you get that spread around because people that have the power and the voice to do so give wrong information. And you think about...
Oh,
go ahead.
What's happening?
I was just going to quickly say, and it frankly upsets me that I think even more than Barcheck, that people like Clint's Reptiles, who appeals, to be honest, Barcheck does appeal to a youngish audience, but Clint's Reptiles, who is literally sort of 10-year-old audience, literally says on the Ball Python episode that's got, I don't know how many, a lot of views at least, keep them in a rack. And it's quite upsetting that from, that even children are being, who maybe don't even own reptiles, but maybe possibly do in the future, are being sort of peddled this misinformation and this my way or the highway sort of mentality from such a sort of young age. And it's quite sad, to be honest, from an emotional point of view.
I didn't know that.
It's literally on his video, his ball python video. He literally says, "Yeah, you can keep them in a vivarium." Something along the lines. I hope I'm right. If I'm wrong, just beep all this section out. But he literally
we'll leave
just
it, but
says,
just beep it.
He literally says something along the lines of, "Yeah, they do okay in a vivarium, but if you really want to keep them properly, keep them in a rack." And it's like, I've got my tree. Yeah, it's got like my affiliate links down below if you want to look at rack systems. So it's it's really quite sad. Yeah, exactly.
Going back on the quality of information, like, I just want to make it clear to people that YouTube actually recognizes whether you're an authority on a subject on YouTube based on the amount of times you've made a video on that topic. So if you make a video with the word ball python in a description, tags, and title 1,000 times, YouTube automatically assumes that you're an authority on that subject and they push your videos harder. So obviously, if those videos get no views, it doesn't really matter because they're not getting viewed anyway. But the power is in the viewer. If you watch something like that and you add to the speed at which it grows by giving those likes, by giving those views, by giving that retention, by giving it a good click-through rate, you are fueling it. I'm not saying that's like this is all your fault or anything. I'm just saying like this is how YouTube works. So I'm just saying that just because you enjoyed watching something because it's colourful and it's got pretty reptiles doesn't mean the information he provided was correct, and that means nothing to YouTube.
You're going to write a hit list, all the channels you should unsubscribe from.
Yeah. Honestly, I do wish I could, but you don't know. Someone one day might just do a complete turnaround and have amazing closures the next day, so you can't just write someone off. But
well, what I want to say is I want to be with saying what has been said is I want to make it abundantly clear that I do understand very much where people coming in on the hobby come from. So, as an example, just going back to my early years keeping reptiles, when I was like 11 or something, I got my first leopard gecko. And then I think I got me corn snake. The several months later or something like that. And I remember at the time, with the leopard gecko, I wanted to know how to supplement that animal's food, because I'd read on like basically every care sheet and all the YouTube videos I watched, which was how I learned how to keep reptiles back in the day, you know, my very first one. And I wanted something that would tell me what to do. This is what you're meant to do. Do it. Because I thought that if I go on one care sheet and it's an R in and it suggests, okay, you need supplements for that animal. Well, I'm thinking, how much of, firstly, which supplement am I meant to use? There's loads to buy. How much do I provide of that supplement? You know, they say, dust it on. Well, how much is too dust? You could put a tiny sprinkle on, or you could completely coat the things. And I just didn't know. And I remember this, it was like really bothering me at the time, that I couldn't just find out what the right amount of supplement to put on was. And I eventually found a thread on some random reptile internet forum where somebody said, feed the leopard gecko every day, giving it plain calcium carbonate powder 5 days a week and calcium with D3 on the weekends. And that was the only place I remember finding. There was probably other places, but I just didn't know how to access them. That was the only place I remember finding a schedule. And so I did that with that leopard gecko because it really bothered me that people just suggest, oh yeah, you need to use some supplements. Oh yeah, you can get calcium with D3 and without D3, and you can get multivitamins. But nobody told me what I had to do. So I basically went out of my way to find out what do they need. I was thinking it's concrete. People keep these things. They must know what they need. So I'll just find somebody who does it, and then that'll work for me too. And then when I got my corn snake, and I was still using that same method of, watching big YouTubers to find out how to keep them, they would say like, oh, well, I've got these here and I don't use UVB, so that's the way to do it. So I never entertained using lighting for my corn snake initially. And, so what I'm really getting at is I understand wanting to know what you are meant to do, because if you're looking at these things, you probably do want to do the best thing for your animal. If you've watched this far, not when we said this far earlier, this far. If you've watched this
well
far,
done again.
yeah, well done. But if you have watched this far,
then you definitely reach one of these points.
little milestones just like through the video.
Little gold stars.
Collect all the points and you'll win like a UVB
achievements unlocked.
If you've got this far, you have to write in the comments, I made it to the second level. so we know for sure.
Well, no. What you ought to do is say like a species of reptile that they write in the description.
Okay, yeah. What should we pick?
Smooth
Vietnamese
snake.
black-breasted leaf turtle.
Yeah, no, do that.
Specific.
Yeah. Yeah, no, go Joseph's, whatever that was.
Say that again, Joe.
Vietnamese black-breasted leaf turtle. If you can get the
Okay, you have
scientific
to write that
name,
in the
we'll
comments.
accept.
Yeah, we'll put that in the comments, and
You're
we'll
part of
know.
the
We'll give you a
club.
like if you came by and you made it this far. So anyway, Joe, finish that point.
He's forgotten now.
That point. Yeah, if you have watched this far, then you surely do want to know how to keep that reptile. But to summarise, the point is, we need to get across that the way to know to keep the reptile is to know that we don't know.
Yeah.
If you can learn one thing about keeping reptiles, that's it. We don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, you can tell someone how not to keep a reptile, but the optimal way to keep a reptile is unknown.
It's a project that has no end. It's a bottomless project that you get to continue to work on forever. So just come at it with an open mind. And I really do hate the phrase that we have in our society now that is, this is the information age. And I've talked about this before on the podcast. I completely disagree with that statement entirely. This is the age of entertainment as far as I'm concerned. That's all, that has just swarmed everybody. Just think about who are the most popular and famous people in our society. They're just actors and entertainers rather than, our philosophers and our scientists, which it would have been, in Greece, for example, in ancient Greece. So we are, everything is designed to keep people's attention and not necessarily designed to give them the information. So, and I think that's part of where the confusion comes in. It's like, oh, this is the age of information. I'll go on YouTube and I'll get the information. But how do you judge the information? So I think, like Joe is saying, open-mindedness is the best way. Use it as a rough template and then go from there.
Well, one of the things that I'll say is we unfortunately don't have not even a pleasure, but the opportunity to just go online and type in care sheet for, I don't know, smooth snake. There's literally no information. The information that I've got for the care has been from different people who kept them in the zoos, a few contacts, a few friends who kept them. But the major source of information, not only for smooth snake, but literally every species we keep, are two great books by that are actually quite old, that document the sort of the wild habitat and a bit of the captivity, because both Derek Fraser and Malcolm Smith kept these animals in captivity. And literally just for like common lizards, it's like 30 pages of biology, all with graphs and just absolutely invaluable information. And this is the source that we've based all of our so like courtship cycles, and we use these as a basis for if we know that the animals are healthy. And that these are the primary sources that we use, is literally directly from the wild.
What is the title and the author of that book?
It won't be much use to anyone, but these are just reptiles and amphibians in Britain, and then this one by Derek Fraser, and then this one is the British Reptiles and Amphibians. This is a really old book. This is actually an antique copy, this one. Cool. So you had to pay quite a lot of money for this one, but they've got literally invaluable information, range maps, cycles, some awesome illustrations, measurements, different, so like all sorts of incredible data. And that is the primary source that we use. So I would encourage anyone, if you're interested in getting whatever species, to try and find a book that's credible. These are the best books on the subject. Try and find a book that's credible about the animal in question. So if you can find, even older books are sometimes good, and sort of base your care on that. I'm kind of aiming this at a beginner, but if you kind of base your care off literally how the animal is in the wild, plus maybe use a framework of what people are saying, how people keep them at the moment, you could probably find a sort of method of keeping them that is pretty sound in terms of husbandry, and definitely sound in terms of the mindset, the holistic mindset and the progressive mindset that is what we're saying is needed for a better hobby and husbandry of animals.
It's great. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I think, and I think as a pet tuber, if you happen to be a pet tuber listening to this, be careful of the specific or the concrete language that you use. You want to be encouraging the listeners and the viewers to stay open-minded, just like Harvey's saying, and treating your care guide as a recipe to make banana chocolate chip muffins is not setting them up for success. Now I'm hungry.
And I think
I'm joining the club.
I'm actually quite hungry now too.
You said bananas and I've got one over there, so I'm dying now.
And I think as a person making content on YouTube, you have to be willing to, once you learn that something you said in the past was wrong, you have to be willing to delete old content, even if it does have loads of views, because that's damaging.
Mm.
If you've made a video in the past saying, "Oh, just keep a snake on a heat mat," and now you know that the science and physics behind that means that a heat lamp is the most beneficial thing a snake can have, then ideally you need to delete that old video because it's damaging.
My only issue with that would be, doesn't deleting the videos give a sense, kind of have the opposite effect? You know, if we want to have this, if we want to show people this stage of progression.
That's true.
So here's something that I did I have a video about making these radiant heat panels that I made years ago. And at the time I thought that was 100%. And now I understand the difference between heat sources, and I still understand that you could use a heat mat or radiant heat panel for certain parts of your husbandry, but it's not necessarily the best, and it shouldn't be your sole source of heat. So on that video, the top pinned comment actually says, I do agree with this method of making this radiant heat panel, but I disagree with using this as its only heat source. And I forget exactly how I worded it. And then I pin my video to my information about my halogen bulb and putting that in my carpet python enclosure. And I've actually drawn people from that video to the carpet python, halogen video, which has worked out really interesting. So you get that because they're searching, how do you make a radiant heat panel? That's the video that pops up. How many of those people can I draw over to teach them about infrared A and infrared B? So that's one way you can do it too. And if you do have a video that's just horribly wrong and you're talking about, I don't know, what's some really bad husbandry, like using tile or something for bearded dragon, something like that, maybe you want to consider taking it down, but maybe there's a gray area too.
I think YouTube wasn't a good place for that years back when they had annotations. You could just add an annotation over the entire video saying, this is outdated now, come look at this video. And they can click on that annotation, go straight there. You don't have that now, so it's a little bit more difficult. But I agree, there is a grey area.
Yeah, it's like I've got old videos. I've got they're actually some of the most viewed videos on my channel with like 15,000 views a piece or something. I've got leopard gecko heating and lighting, corn snake heating and lighting, crested gecko heating and lighting. The crested gecko one, I think, is the earliest one of the bunch. And in that, I say it's beneficial to give them just a little bit of a heat source. And I say, you can use UV, but you don't need it. I said that. That's on YouTube. I did say that. But it is, I don't remember how I edited it. There's at least a pinned comment. I might have edited the description and possibly the title as well to say archived. That it's left up there, and I did actually private it at one point because I thought I'll just get rid of this. But then again, it's like, if somebody does watch or does just click that video and sees that I've updated it and moves to the new stuff, well, there's sort of an argument there that at least I'm dragging them towards, I don't know. It's
another hand reaching out to pull someone towards correct information, sort of thing.
And yeah, it's one of these what Harvey's phrase. what do you say?
What?
Cognitive dissonance or something. It's one of
Yeah,
your
yeah,
phrases
yeah,
you
yeah,
use
yeah.
all the time.
Well, one of the things I'd also say is if a person is just watching Joe's video from 5 years ago or whenever it was and taking that literally as the only piece of information, then they shouldn't be keeping an animal anyway, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
do you get what and I think very few people, although I may be surprised, just watch one video and take it as the only thing. If you are genuinely committed to keeping an animal, and Joe will know what I mean, you get to a point where you watch every single video there is possible on YouTube you've watched, you know, and you kind of have to sort of think that give people more credit than maybe what you'd think they're due, if you understand, and especially people who want to keep an animal.
Yeah, I agree. Unless it's like, if it's not a common species like a Mexican black king snake, like back before they were even more popular now, I would be like looking for videos, but I've seen that one, seen that one, seen that one.
Yeah.
So you do watch more than one. I would hope anyway. Yeah.
Because you just want to see the animal. Like, you're just looking for video of the animal, especially if you don't have it. I just want to see what that looks like moving through the enclosure. And yeah, you if you have a rare species, you'll run out of videos really quick.
When I was about 9, I was like absolutely obsessed with goldfish, and I was like wanting to keep goldfish. And I remember YouTube used to have a favourites feature on the app, and I remember I had like several thousand videos that were all just 30 seconds of people having filmed the goldfish in just
Number one fan.
But, I suppose...
Number one fin.
Oh no.
Anyway, let's change the topic from what I just said. The other point that I wanted to bring up is the fact that we say this about YouTube and how it can be damaging. It can also be very, very positive. Mm-hmm. You think there's groups like Advancing Herpetological Husbandry, or there's not just a Pet Rock Python Regis, really good Facebook groups for those species, but they only have a limited reach of 18,000 at the most for Advancing Herpetological Husbandry. I can't even say it. But YouTube is the second largest search engine, and it's where, whether you like it or not, you say, or read books and stuff, first place you go as part of your research is YouTube. Mm-hmm. You will watch a video even if you're watching books as well. You just do.
Watching books.
I'm watching books and I'm not absorbing any of this information.
Watching books and reading videos.
It won't play.
But it is true, even on reptile related things, if I have a question, I will often go to YouTube first, especially if it's something I need to do. Like the other day, my sink was doing something weird. And I'm like, how do you take the bottom thing off? Just go to go to YouTube.
Yeah,
I just want to watch a video. I want someone to show me how to do it. So there is some serious power there.
Especially these younger audiences, the first place they go to is YouTube. I mean, Joe said how he was, and I do it now, and I'm not even young, so you know what it's like, and you know the power YouTube has. So you think that, we've got a few thousand subscribers sort of thing. If you get to the point where you are at 50,000, 100,000, and you're putting correct information out, and you do get to the point where you can make a difference, and I mean massive difference. I mean, Barczyk had massive negative difference, but imagine if you can have massive positive difference to welfare. And that is a massive thing. I it's really sad, but I don't want to say it's like just a person with a YouTube channel. I see it as an absolute mission. Mm-hmm. It's almost like an ideology that you're trying to. I feel like I'm one of them Jehovah's Witnesses that go door to door trying to convert you, but but that is what I feel like. Because
do you guys have 2 minutes to talk about bioactive enclosures?
There is information. I can't do it without smiling now. There is information that that people don't know that they can have access to because it isn't in the mainstream. Like if I tell you, if I walk up to you and I tell you, that ball pythons are semi-arboreal and they catch bats in the trees, and they literally sit there in that strike position in that S-shaped neck like a green tree python, you're going to look at me and you're like, you're an idiot. Because I can't show you study after study after study after study after study in like 30 seconds. But on YouTube, you can not only do that, but you can also show them visual examples of that behavior from an animal. Like, you can make a video so solid that, like, you just lay it out for someone on a plate. Like, you found all the literature at that point in time that is available, and you've just laid it out for everyone. And the people that don't know how to access scientific papers and how to decipher them, how to read them properly, that is something that is very, very valuable. So you think a video with 100 million, with 1 million views, with scientifically correct information, says, look, go read papers. They don't just sit in a burrow. That has a massive difference. Also psychological as well, because people think biocheck, loads, big numbers, big amount of animals, that equates to popular, equates to right. Well, if you're popular and you're actually right, can you imagine what the effect on welfare on animals across the world could be? And the people that are watching... What's that?
No, finish.
Okay. The people that are watching, you think like, oh, you're just watching a video, that was nice. But every view you give to a video that is like, this study, that is correct up to that point in time anyway, you are enabling it to go further and do more, for more people to see it and for it to affect their animals as well. Like, even like you leaving a like or you leaving a comment, I don't think people realise how much power they have. Just by sharing a video. You could, one person that you shared that to, or you shared it and one person saw it, if they've got 20 odd animals and they saw that video and they're like, wow, I'm fully behind this, and they change everything they do with their animals, you yourself, by the act of just sharing a video that has all these studies and that's correct, you yourself has positively influenced those animals.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. They are actually as equally responsible as the information that's being provided, helping spread it.
There's also I don't see it as just like, oh, just support your favorite YouTuber, because at this point it's like, no, it's more than this at this point. Like, you're trying to do this together.
You're part of the mission.
Yeah, you're part of this. Like, come on.
Joe, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to return slightly to like the responsibility that we have as content creators. Is when you're saying about like the sheer number of reptiles that, or amphibians that can be or any animals, to be honest, just in the whole pet tube thing, that can be affected by a single video, is the power of videos over Facebook groups, or you know, just things like that, word of mouth, basically, is the reusability. Is that if you spend a month doing nothing but researching and planning and designing that 5-minute video, and you put that up, and that strikes people and they enjoy watching it, but more importantly, they get the message across that there are ways that they can improve their care, and that more importantly, they need to be thinking about how they are going to continue to improve their care, then that video that you've made, that even if the bits of information go out of date, as long as you've put it across that this is current, this can be changed, then that message is reusable. Like, for as long as YouTube remains as a platform, people can still watch that video. It's not like you put up a really clever Facebook post and then a week later it disappears. It's YouTube gives you that power to keep referring to it. In word of mouth, you can tell people, watch this video. People can share it. They can say, this video was really good. Oh, I watched this several years ago and I still remember the video. You can have a look at this. You know, it's content creators watching this really need to realise that what they're doing, it's not just a laugh. It's not just them getting ad revenue. It's not just their job, oh, they make videos about reptiles. That means something, and they need to take it seriously, to be honest. Because you can probably tell I'm getting slightly annoyed now because people don't.
You can probably tell we're quite idealistic about it. Like, it's not just videos to us.
Well, one of the things that I was going to say, and this is very idealistic, one of the motivations for us setting up Celtic Reptile and Amphibian's YouTube channel is if we had the same viewership that, say, Camp Kennan has, or even bigger like Brian Borchek, we could literally save species from extinction in Europe with that much viewership and that much if we did have some sort of fundraiser like Patreon, whatever. There, and also we could also, push for projects such as re-establishing and rewilding amphibians and reptiles across the whole of the UK. That'd be done like easy peasy because we'd be providing sort of social interest on a subject that is kind of untouched, especially in this part of the world. So I think if we keep that positive and hope and a good cause at heart, then if we do eventually get there, and hopefully we do, those sort of values that we've always held and the motivation for doing so will be strong, and people will acknowledge that. And actually we'll be able to make a change both, in the welfare and conservation aspect of the hobby. And I think that many people, the bigger YouTubers, don't have that core set of values to adhere to. And that's why when we sort of set up Celtic, we came up with an ethos, and we've got that we thought it important to include publicly. And it's an ethos I've got up on the wall there, because if I can constantly be looking at that, I know that it's like the 10 Commandments. It's something that we as a company need to live by in order to fulfill all sorts of goals. And I think that people don't self-reflect enough on their actions and how they can affect the world and other people. And I think if everyone just spent literally 10 minutes a week thinking about what I'm talking, even in general, to be honest, spent 10 minutes a week thinking about what they've done and how that has affected the world, we would live in a much better place. And I think that runs through with a platform just like YouTube. If everyone reflected on what their channel does and what they stand for, just for a small portion of their time, we would have a much more informational and informed platform in which people can learn, and of which, we would benefit massively if we want to advance the husbandry and advance our holistic view of keeping.
Agreed.
I think, the hobby could be so much more than what it is in the moment. You think you had the power to influence people and tell them, look, we need to start thinking about genetics and to not be inbreeding everything, and we need to see these as yes, you have a pet reptile, so you're going to get pet keepers that just got a pet snake. Yes, well, maybe this doesn't apply to them, but if you're a hobbyist and you have multiple reptiles, and this is your daily thing, you wake up thinking about reptiles, then the contributions you can have to conservation by actually creating a viable captive population, by viable I mean genetically healthy, I don't mean just lots of animals, then the potentials that you can actually contribute to is huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's almost a fallacy in some ways. As a keeper, you think, I don't have much control over the hobby, I'm just one keeper. But you do actually have a lot of just an individual keeper with a couple of animals. For one, anybody that comes to your home, if you have good quality care, that's what those people are going to leave with. If you do take any pictures or happen to post things on Instagram, again, you're promoting good care. But even for myself, I would say it's 4 years ago now, I remember commenting on a forum basically saying, what is going on with the hobby? We have some serious issues here that nobody's really discussing. There's major care issues. We have this industrialized style, but for me, it was more so seeing a lot of the sort of the turnover of animals in local classifieds and whatnot, where you have people that care for an animal for a year, they basically almost kill it and then decide they're bored of it and they want to get rid of it. That was happening a lot, especially in my area. So I was sort of seeing that. And then fast forward 4 years later, where my name and my channel is one of the names that comes up when people discuss improving reptile welfare. And that's a really weird experience for me because 4 years ago I was kind of
good though.
Yeah, it does feel good, and you guys would be in the exact same boat as well. And that was a couple years ago. I was just a keeper that had questions, and now we have this platform where we're sharing these ideas. And even if you don't want to do something on YouTube or on Instagram, just being a person that takes better quality care of your animals is a massive benefit to the hobby.
I couldn't agree more with that, and I won't be long, Liam. Don't worry.
Sorry, rabbiting on.
What was I going to say?
I was just finishing saying.
I've got it. I've got it. Come back. Some people, like Harvey and Tom, are really clever about the way they're doing things, because they have, as you just said, an ethos, a thing they want to end up doing. But for me, I do have my own sort of ideas, as you can probably tell, about what I think a YouTube channel's responsibility is. But in my original creation of it, it was more that sort of accidental. I am where I am now, but I've never ever planned to have that as a business, or it's not. Whether it ever will be, I don't know now, because it's got to the point where there's even more responsibility, and I've got to ask more questions about, okay, when this goes further, because I've no intentions of stopping, am I going to start having to draw lines? But my point is, those videos, where they come from, is just me wanting to find out more about things, and it's sort of originally, and still today, is just an outlet for that. I've been learning something or found something out, and I genuinely find it really interesting. And the best way to sort of, just learning things and knowing about them's good. But to talk about them and have somebody else understand that with you is like, it's just a good feeling. And being on my own, like not knowing anybody in person that keeps reptiles, like on the day to day, certainly years ago, I know all you folks these days, but back in the day, I didn't really have anybody to talk to. So to make videos and come out and say, oh, well, I've learned this, and this seems right, and I can make this. And then you polish it off, and you've done that video, and it's like, yes, I've learned this topic now. I understand this. The more you do it, the more you're going to come back and you realise, okay, well, what I said then wasn't quite right. But I can make this video and polish it off again. And then you get that same feeling. People comment and share their ideas and develop on it. And it's just that trajectory of going from an interested hobbyist to all of a sudden you have a responsibility. But, that responsibility begins when you are that small hobbyist. Like Liam says, if you're watching the videos, which ones you like, which ones you comment on, which ones you bother to watch the last 20 seconds of, because watch time is a huge thing in the YouTube algorithm, that is your responsibility then. If you go and make videos yourself, then you'll end up like me thinking, bloody hell, I do have a responsibility now, and I do need to sit down and think about this. And, it's responsibility, man.
I was just having a quick check on the phone just to see if anyone, like any big reptile YouTubers, did have an ethos. It doesn't seem like it. I've only had a quick look, so I can't, because I wanted to be founded in that claim that they're uninformed idiots. But but one of the things that I'd like to have a look at, and it'd be a bit polarizing, but what would your thoughts be on if we made a criteria, a detailed criteria on which to judge channels, and maybe come out with a score out of like 100, say, and like maybe over 75 is acceptable, something like that? Because it's the way of diet. For instance, mental health. The way that in the US and the UK we diagnose mental health is very similar, we look at basically like a criteria, and then it's ranked upon loads of different like statistics. So maybe we could do something similar to that, but for different channels. Of course, there would be some subjective element because we've got to decide different aspects, but it would be interesting to because the problem is, the biggest problem with the whole of advancing welfare, etc., is that it's hard to judge. We know Brian Barczyk bad, let's say, Camp Kennan good, for instance. But what is it that really separates them apart? Do you know what I mean? What are all the extrinsic values that separate those two different people apart, so starkly, as it were? And so wouldn't it be good to maybe assign a value or assign a set of criteria to that, so we could basically measure everyone with the same meter stick?
So I had this thought, with COVID and like Twitter saying about COVID misinformation, they like shut things down if it's wrong. I did think about, I wonder if YouTube would ever like do something like that. If they say like, oh, just keep like a leopard gecko without UV and no infrared A or anything, just on a heat mat, whether they would actually say, well, that's misinformation. But because you can do it, you can't really say it's a difficult topic, isn't it? Because something will stay alive like that. So can you say that's incorrect? Well, we'd say it's incorrect because the animal's not thriving. But can YouTube like actually say, well, we're shutting that down because we don't want that being spread around?
I wouldn't want that.
No, nor would I.
Definitely wouldn't want it.
Because the problem you get there, is you become the Gestapo by saying that's right, that's wrong. And if we want to take a scientific, holistic approach, then you've got to have a debate. You've got to have a variety of viewpoints across the board in order to move forward. And I don't think suppressing the sort of views which we would disagree with are necessarily right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, science does work with the open flow of discussion, and dogma is a big problem, right? And then, exactly like you're saying, who decides what is what? Joe?
Yeah, I do want to say as well that you risk stunting progression, because several years ago, if somebody had made a video about leopard geckos and said don't use UV lamps with them, everybody would have thought that was right. You could have an algorithm come out and destroy all videos that say use UV lamps with leopard geckos, and all of a sudden that step forwards is gone. So I think for me, as you talk about a scale of ranking channels, it is just that simple single criterion of, are they trying
or not
to progress? Because really, if you are trying to progress, then you can't defend doing something that is currently held as wrong. If, for example, you're saying that you're being progressive and whatever, and you're using a rack system and telling people not to use lights, well, if you really were being progressive and really were sitting down and thinking about that, then in this day and age, you would not be saying that. So it's that single criterion of being genuinely progressive. You might say stuff that's wrong. You might, come out with individual facts that aren't correct. I do that all the time. And I would like to think that that's perfectly fine, as long as you are aware of that. Just that being aware that there isn't a right way to do things, that your main message, your main responsibility is to teach people to progress. And if a channel does that, no matter how good it is in any other respect, I would say watch it if you enjoy it.
That leads me on to what I was going to say originally, was you think about how there are some channels, like we say PetTube is like a really negative thing, but there are some animal channels that they watch a video and then they make a video and they just copy that video.
Not there.
I'm not on about that, but like saying about
in joke.
But like saying like beardies and bathing them. Some person will watch like 10 videos on bathing a bearded dragon, then they'll go make their own. Well, if you get to the point where you're getting a substantial amount of views and you're saying this scientifically correct information is this, and the viewers are learning and are saying, well, I've seen the study, I've read the study with him, I understand that concept, and if they go see another video that's wrong and they come saying this isn't right because this study, they can point people towards correct information. The more voices that start pointing things out that are wrong, then the more pressure it is for those poor channels that just want to do things for ad revenue to conform to what is socially accepted to stay relevant on the platform. So eventually, I know it's quite a slow snowball now, but it should get to the point where everyone's going to be saying use UV for snakes because they have the pressure to say that to stay relevant on YouTube. If that makes sense.
Well, I've always said we want the progression and the eagerness to move towards better care to come from the hobby and not to come from a government legislation, because the government is usually terrible at making rules because it's coming from people that don't necessarily know the animals that well, and it's just so much more positive if it comes from us and the keepers to self-regulate. And yeah, exactly, like, you know, most people could point out when a dog is kept in a poor condition. It's like, is that dog outside all the time on a chain and he doesn't get to come in, there's no walks or whatever? Most people go, hey, that's not right. But if you go back 25, 30, even 30 years ago, that's your sort of standard dog care. But now you probably get your neighbor call animal services on you and say, hey, this animal's not being cared properly. And I assume the hobby can creep towards that as well, where you can't just put your dog on a chain on YouTube and say this is how you care, because you're going to have a bunch of commenters going, say, hey, where's your dog's UVB?
Exactly. When you get to
I'm mixing up my
when
yeah,
you get
guys
to
know
that
what I mean.
point, then that is where serious change across the hobby happens.
Yeah.
I mean, like a dog will survive if he does not walk every day, but we still say daily walking exercise is an essential part of dog care. So we should get to the point where UVB is essential part of reptile care, regardless of whether it survives or not, because it's an essential part of care.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's just we need to progress faster. Animal rights. It's not just people complaining and with a sign saying abuse and this. It's actual scientists now writing papers, pointing things out, saying this is wrong. And if we have things like racks as like the main thing you find when you're looking for reptiles, then we, as a hobby, you deserve everything you get.
Yeah.
I mean, the things they say isn't without reason.
They are nipping at our heels. Yeah, the animal
Exactly.
rights groups are nipping at our heels, and the points they make, yes, they make bad points as well, but some of the points they make are correct. And I've always said, if we leave anything outside for them to see and misinterpret, that's our fault, or even properly interpret, that's our fault.
Yeah, just as like a bit of a one-liner, really. I don't want to be the one defending rat keeping when the animal rights activists get onto it.
Exactly. That's why I always compare reptile keeping as a court case, and I think maybe I even said this with the podcast with Harvey, is if we have a lawyer, we want his folder full of, you know, captive breeding and, you know, maintaining healthy stock of animals that are at risk in the natural world, and, you know, learning new things about these species on a scientific level. We don't want, hey, we have 1,000 snakes on this wall and a bunch of them are spider morph and they have a funny corkscrew when they walk, or slither. It's like, that's not what we want our lawyer to go in with. We want them to go in with sort of substantial and just good information that we can prove that the hobby has a benefit. And exactly right, Joe. I wouldn't want to be the guy trying to use racks and spider morphs as our defense.
This is the problem that I have with these, like, was it Repta in the UK that defends the hobby against like legislation, animal rights and stuff, and the US have their own version. I can't remember what it's called.
USARC.
USARC.
Yes, but for the sake, they would just defend the hobby for the sake of defending the hobby, like rat keeping alive. And I always say you do not represent me. Like, I condemn the rat keeping just as much as the animal rights do, because they're right. They're right to condemn it.
Yeah, I agree. You're right.
Yeah, it's when they say all of this together, this is the hobby, we must defend it, then the animal rights and legislation will say we'll bring down the hobby. Where if there's a clear thing where saying we're not good, that's not good enough, then it's about raising standards rather than just getting rid of captive reptiles.
Yeah.
And I was thinking maybe because this is a very, very long podcast. It's a very long podcast. I know, like the way you did with John Courtney Smith, you like kind of cut up some and added them to as an extra video.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe points we've made later on in the video that we might think people might not get to, we should have that as separate videos on top of that.
Yeah, I can definitely do that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else any other points that people want to make? Because we are getting into the 2 hour something minutes here, and I would like to start wrapping it up slowly. Are there any things that we haven't said, or that's a point that's on the tip of your tongue you'd like to make?
One of the only things that I would say that I think needs stressing is, why is animal welfare important, other than the actual animal in question would be living in a better environment and having a better level of care. And the things that me and Tom, and we actually thought about this before we did the podcast with Dylan ages ago, was that we need to have a good set of arguments to convince people why is this important, other than it's just going to make the animal feel better, because people don't listen in those sorts of terms. So for instance, like with the whole conservation movement, the argument that, we should protect the earth because it's our right to do so is okay, is good enough, but it's only good enough for the people who are already converted. The arguments that work and get people in power and people who own land to conserve the land is to say you'll get better water quality, there'll be less pollutants in the air, greater biodiversity, it'll stop extinction, it'll increase productivity on agricultural land, you'll get less pest invertebrates, etc., etc. And so we need to have the same set of arguments with why is increasing welfare important. And I can remember some of them off the top of my head, some of them being, if we've got animals in a good setup, in an environment which is similar to that of the wild, then we will behavior like the snake that I saw the other day, behavior which could not be observed in the wild, just because logistically you cannot sit next to a smooth snake for 24 hours a day in a viewable condition. That is an extrinsic point that needs stressing, that if we keep animals well, we will be able to learn things for the scientific community that we could not otherwise do. Second point being, if we, for instance, allow our animals to brumate, we will get better yields of babies when they breed. And that is a point which breeders will listen to. If you let animals naturally brumate, then they'll be better off in terms of how productive they are. Another point being, if we expose animals to UV and to proper good lighting, they will look more beautiful. They will be better for the keeper, to look at and go, wow, that is an amazing animal. And so I think we need to think about these sort of values which, other than it's better to the animal, we need to think about sort of other points which support the argument that will convince people who are not possibly opposed to the motion. And I think one of the other things that needs stressing as well is the majority of people we need to convert are not like Kevin McCurley, or people who don't know, who are people who keep their leopard gecko without UV because they know no better. Those are the people we have got to convert. I hate that word, but you know what I mean. Convince and show that this is a better way of keeping the animals. So, yeah, I think we need to think bigger than just this is better for the animal because it feels better, which we know. I know I get pleasure in the fact that my animals are happy. But a breeder with 250 ball pythons does not give a shit, quite frankly. And so we need to be thinking about exactly, yeah,
a deeper why.
Yeah,
exactly, yeah. And I think that'd be a great video. I wouldn't mind doing a collaboration with you, Liam, on a video like that, possibly.
Okay.
I think what you're saying, because I'm about halfway through Feral now. It's been a bit slow going reading it, because I've had several books on the go at once. But I've just sort of read a bit where he was talking about the reintroduction of wolves, and
Yes,
he sort of
yeah,
says
yeah.
the same bit where, like, well, you've already read it, but for Liam and Dylan's sake.
Excuse me?
Oh wait, you've already read it, haven't you?
I read it.
All right, for Dylan's sake then.
I've watched it.
Well in, Dylan, that was a good one.
I'm out.
Is this about the wolves being introduced to Yellowstone, or?
Just
Can I just jump in?
Yes.
The wolves are being reintroduced to Colorado, where Laurie is, and Laurie apparently, I text Laurie saying, "Oh, this is happening. This is great." She apparently voted in favor of it. So brilliant. We're getting some. There's going to be some more wolves in Colorado being released. I think they're Occidentalis subspecies. Sorry, I'm a nerd with all the wolves, but
See, we have a wolf issue in my province. We have too many, apparently.
can you send some over? We need some in Scotland. Big
I'll grab
time.
some for you.
Can we get some?
Yeah. So Joe, go ahead.
I mean, that's not where I live. Beep.
Yeah, I'll edit that out.
No,
Go ahead, Joe.
All I was saying was, you know, I'm sure all four of us would agree that, well, I suppose it doesn't matter to you, Dylan, but the three of us, the rest of us, really want wolves on the British Isles because we like wolves. We know they belong here, and wolves here would just be like, yes, wolves.
That's gonna be a gif.
Woo! But for most people, it's like wolf, innit?
Yeah,
You know, you've got to incentivize
It's elite my grandmother, that sort of thing, that sort of attitude. I tell you, I was working on the bit. Sorry to jump in, Joe. I was working on the beaver project a couple of years ago, and we were out just doing a bit of habitat survey, and we checked traps because you have to trap the beavers and then tag them and put a microchip in them and take some blood samples, etc. And we bumped into someone, and their cherry tree had been cut down by the beaver, and that just makes me laugh just so much, just thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And they literally, clear as day, said, "Why are you introducing beavers? We would much prefer to have brown bears instead." Like genuine, and I thought, they must be joking. They must be joking, but no. And that's the thing. People have got this idea, this Disneyfication of wildlife, this idea that, you know, you'll sing and the deer will come out the woods, you know, and that sort of really sort of idyllic view of nature, when in all actuality beavers are the most amazing thing that Northern Hemisphere has ever seen. And I'm just going to drop a little thing in for my friend Derek Gow. Read Derek Gow's book, Bringing Back the Beaver. An amazing book, because it goes through the fact that beavers could literally save the world, the fact that they can mitigate climate change by creating dams, riffle sections, they can save amphibian populations, restore invertebrate populations, whatever. And people need to be shown that, and people need to be taught that. And me and Joe were actually on about that. And that's why in the UK we're starting to now get rewilding projects, and people are becoming like eyes open, amazed by, you know, if we let nature just do what it wants to do. But yeah, anyway, I'll go back to Joe.
No. All I was saying to continue your points about is that for people who don't care, there needs to be an incentive, because people will say, you know, I don't want to go on a tangent about wolves, but they say, well, there's a slim chance that they might eat me kids. Yeah. So what? I'm not interested in wolves. I don't want them here. Well, for me, I do want wolves here because I recognise that the chance of me actually being attacked by a wolf is so slim that I would say that just on the face of it, I would think that the benefit of having wolves just to know that they are here is worth that. But for people who aren't interested in them, there needs to be the incentive of, for example, wildlife tourism, bringing in a huge amount of funds, of keeping the deer away from the sites for upland forests to regrow, which can, you know, if the forests regrow, then you change the properties of the soil, you can alter flooding effects, it's trapping more carbon. You know, there's incentives for people to have them that aren't just, I like wolves, we should all like them.
Yeah.
Just to bring this back to reptiles and why, not that wasn't important. I mean, just for people that are watching that necessarily might get bored. One of the reasons why welfare is important to reptiles, and you've got to give them a reason as to why that's important. Or straight away, higher welfare. Let's say UVB. UVB gives you a higher yield because the mother is more healthy, so she's able to produce more young. The young are instantly healthy because they've got that D3 from the mother, so they're instantly healthy as well. So less die in that first initial period. Reptile Mountain TV, his skinks, he was getting stillborns. As soon as he provided UVB, 100% survival rate of the young. You think that some young, like raw pythons, may not feed. Well, UVB has a major role to play in their metabolism. So you think those royals that die because they don't feed, well, UVB could be the answer to that. You think near-infrared heat sources, well, the animals live longer. It's been proven in rats, mice, and fruit fly that just being given access to near-infrared radiation extends the lifespan by I think it was 160 to 255% longer lifespan just from having that heat. And you can say, well, that doesn't apply to reptiles. Well, those studies were made and then the results were being applied to humans. So if fruit flies are applicable to humans, I'd argue that the results are all applicable to reptiles as well. And then you say things like, they digest better because they're heated properly. They heal properly because the near-infrared has healing properties. I mean, heliotherapy is used for racehorses because for better performance and when they have injuries. It's used in medical labs. Being able to have a complex environment means the animal is more intelligent and they solve things more quickly. That can apply to how quickly they figure out how to mate. They can figure out how to eat properly. Having a healthy animal from all these things above means less expensive vet bills, less often even going to have to even use a vet. I can keep going, but the list is massive. People need to realize that there's a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap up. What do you guys think?
Just drop the mic, Liam.
I did it out of frame, didn't I?
No one can see that.
I think we're all going to be ready for a bloody lie down after this one.
That's right. Well, thank you guys very much for doing this. This was great. We are, for the listeners, this is something that's going to 100% be some semi-regular experience, we'll call it. We'll do some roundtables more often than not because I think these are great, and we can, as we know, we can go on forever because we've had these conversations privately, and finally we've had one as a official podcast. So that was great. So thank you guys very much. This was mind-blowing and fantastic.
No problem.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much for having us on. It's been a pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the very first roundtable discussion. Liam, Joseph, Harvey, thank you so much for having that fantastic conversation. I know after we had the conversation, you guys continued to do way more talking after I left the Zoom open. I had to leave to go put my winter tires on, but these guys kept talking for, I think, 2 hours after, so who knows what that conversation went into. But anyway, thank you very much for joining me. Listeners, if you made it through the entire episode, thank you so much for listening to everything. Join us in the discussion. You can come to the YouTube video and leave a comment or a question or something that you've been thinking about, or if there's a point that you want to make, leave it in there. I know all 4 of us will be in the comments answering questions or commenting back and forth with you guys. I will talk to you guys on Sunday when I release my next episode of the Animals at Home podcast. I will talk to you then. Bye.